if we want to elevate at a foundational level, it's about healing our minds, our bodies, and our hearts. And if we want to become transformationally better, that's what it requires. It requires healing. And I've just come to learn that most of us need some healing.
Top leaders, meaningful conversation, actionable advice, bulldoze complacency, ignite inspiration, create impact. Produced by Southwestern family of companies. This is the Action Catalyst.
Are you interested in advertising with the Action Catalyst? Our listeners could be hearing about your brand right here, right now. For details, shoot us an email at info@theactioncatalyst.com.
So we're here today, once again, actually, with best-selling author, professor, and leadership expert, Ryan Gottfredson. Ryan, good to see you.
Yeah, great to be back on. I was looking at the notes and my notes, and I think the last time I was on was over 5 years ago.
Yes, so episode 317 back in January of 2020 is when we last had you on, and boy, did things change abruptly right after that.
Yeah, so that was January. Fast forward a couple months, and I was with my publisher in Nashville for my first book, Success Mindsets, in March. And we're there the second week of March. I think it was like a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We're doing this red carpet event. I get an email, essentially schools are shutting down. And I'm in Nashville. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what is happening? Am I even going to get a flight back home? And that was the weekend that, of course, the world essentially shut down. And then fast forward 2 months later is when my book actually hit the shelves. And so it was, in some ways, I think there were some good things with that, with the book coming out of that time, and other things, it just made things really difficult. So I think in some ways it was good because a lot of people were maybe spending a little bit more time reading. But on the other hand is I do a lot of consulting work with organizations, and that completely shut down. So I think there were some good things, and that helped it hit the Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller list. But then my business slowed down for a little bit, like many others did. But that's okay. It picked back up, and, we are where we are now, which is a different type of crazy.
Just a little refresher for our audience. We talk a lot on the Action Catalyst about growth mindset, fixed mindset, about mindset in general. For you, there's actually 4. It's not growth and fixed. Do you mind just kind of walking our audience through that? This is part of our table setting for the conversation today.
One of the things that I've learned is mindsets is a term that is thrown out, I feel like, rather loosely. Right? A lot of people talk about maybe leader mindset or entrepreneurial mindset. And oftentimes when people talk about mindsets, they talk about mindsets as our attitude towards something. But actually at a scientific level, even a neuroscientific level, our mindsets are much deeper than our attitude towards something. They're actually the mental lenses that we wear that shape how we view the world around us. And so what that means is our mindsets are the part of ourselves that automatically interprets information in certain ways. So, for example, this is what explains why some people can see failure as something to avoid, but other people see failure as an opportunity to learn and grow. And our mindsets, they really are the most foundational part of who we are. And for most of us, we're not conscious of our mindsets, nor do we know the quality of our mindsets. So the quality of our mindsets exists along a continuum from being more wired for self-protection to being more wired for value creation. And whether we have a self-protective mindset or a value-creating mindset, both feel right to us. But one helps us stay safe in the short term, but holds us back in the long term. That's the self-protective mindset. And the value-creating mindsets allow us to step into short-term discomfort for long-term value creation. So I coach my son's basketball team. My son is 10 years old. That means that he and his teammates are not very good. So it's my job as a coach to help them to develop. And so one of the things that I'm trying to help them develop at this age is they're all right-handed. And I want to help them learn how to shoot a layup with their left hand when they're on the left side of the hoop. So this is a pretty important skill for a basketball player. And so I'll instruct them. When we call them layup lines. They line up on the left side and they take turns to shoot a layup. And I'll ask them, all right, try to shoot this with your left hand. And I get 3 different responses. The first response that I get is I get some players that don't even try to shoot with their left hand. Well, why wouldn't they try to shoot with their left hand? Well, it feels uncomfortable. They're going to look awkward and they're probably going to miss their shot. So there's some justifiable reasons for them to not try that. The second response that I get is I get some players that are willing to try in practice, but they're not willing to try in games. Well, why aren't we willing to try in games? Well, it's because now my parents are recording me for the rest of posterity to see, right? And of course, I don't want to let my team down. I want to win the game. There's a lot more pressure in that moment. So that's the second response that I get. But then the third response that I get, I only have a couple of players that are willing to do this, but they're willing to try in practice and in the games. Well, why are they willing to do this? Well, they've developed this capacity to be able to feel uncomfortable, look uncomfortable, and miss the shot, which may even mean letting their team down in that moment or even in that game. But for what benefit? It's because they will actually improve their development of that skill so that they could be a greater value creator for themselves and for their future teams down the road. So there's some responses that are more self-protective in that moment, and others that are more value creating, meaning they're willing to step into discomfort in that moment to become a better value creator over the long term. Are these responses by my players, are they intentional thought out responses or instinctual knee-jerk reactions? And that's the role that our mindsets play, right? It's my players' mindsets that are dictating when I invite them, do they move towards self-protection or do they move towards value creation? And that's the mindsets. And if I also ask these players, do you have good mindsets? I think that all of them say yes, because they could justify it. Well, the one that's more self-protective, well, it helps me feel more safe and more comfortable in that moment. And the one that has the more value creating mindset is, oh yeah, I've got a better mindset because it's going to help me become a better basketball player for the future, right? So that's the inherent challenge that we as people face. Is we generally think that our mindsets are good, but we generally don't know the quality of our mindsets. And so the reason why I bring this up is it's really helpful to have a mindset framework to help us to start to investigate the true quality of our mindsets. And that's what I put together as what you said is these 4 different sets of mindsets.
If there's something that's so foundational to us and kind of ingrained and shape the way we approach and view everything else, how can we influence or adjust our mindset?
Yeah, great question. And it all starts with awareness. And that's where the framework is so powerful, because if I don't have labels for mindsets, if I don't have descriptions for mindsets, then I can never investigate them. They're going to continue to reside below the level of my consciousness. But if I could put labels on it and descriptions, now I could start to develop greater level of consciousness about my mindsets. And that's been part of my personal journey. Is when I first learned about these different sets of mindsets, I quickly learned that I had self-protective mindsets, which is normal. Most of us have self-protective mindsets. And I just didn't know what better mindsets to have. So the first thing I needed to do was to deepen my awareness. And then once I deepened my awareness, then I could come up with plans and strategies and interventions to be able to elevate my mindset.
Shifting from mindset to growth, the science really points to there being 2 main types of growth. There's incremental, transformational. I think people think they know what each of those means, but could you define those for us?
Yeah, for sure. And it's really helpful for us to understand that there's 2 different sides of ourselves. So I'm going to give you some characters that you probably recognize who they are, and I want you to tell me what you think they have in common. Michael Jackson, Tiger Woods, Ellen DeGeneres, Bill Clinton, Gordon Ramsay, Shia LaBeouf. What do they have in common? They got multiple things in common, I think. So I think most simply, they're all famous and well-known. They have all been incredibly successful within their industry. I mean, they've been maybe at the peak. I mean, we've got the king of pop in there, for goodness sakes, right? So all incredibly successful people. But the other thing that they have in common is they all have some controversy. And so the reason why I've kind of cherry-picked these examples is to demonstrate this idea that we have 2 different sides of ourselves. One side of ourselves is what I call our doing side. It's our talent, our knowledge, our skills, and our abilities. And all of these individuals are incredibly talented, knowledgeable, and skillful individuals. And it's their talent, knowledge, and skills that has allowed them to reach the success that they've experienced, or at least their popularity. But then their controversy doesn't really have anything to do with their talent, knowledge, skills, and abilities. Their controversy has to do with a different side of themselves, and that's what I call our being side. And our being side is the quality of our character, our mindsets, our psyche, the quality of our emotional regulation abilities. I call it as a whole our internal operating system, how our bodies are wired to operate. So each of these individuals were incredibly talented, knowledgeable, and skillful, but they lack some emotional regulation abilities that cause them to misstep at different points of time in their life. And so the reason why I bring this up is coming back to your question is there's a difference between incremental growth and transformational growth. And what I've learned is that when we improve along our doing side, it is helpful. But I find that it is only incrementally helpful. And if we really want to transformationally grow and improve, we've got to focus on our being side. We've actually got to focus on our internal operating system, our mindsets, our emotional regulation abilities. And when we could elevate along our being side, we transformationally become better people and better leaders. And what's interesting about this is that when we think about development efforts in general, is almost all development efforts focus on our doing side. Think about our education systems, our athletic programs, and our organizational development efforts. They almost all focus on gaining knowledge and skills. Yet, it's only incrementally helpful. And so my new book, Becoming Better, is all about helping people learn that they have a being side, learn what it is, help them connect with it and evaluate their altitude along their being side. And then how do they elevate along their being side so that they can transformationally become better?
When it comes to the doing side, most of the time we know what we don't know, right? We know what we need to improve on, what we need to do to get better. How do we assess our being side so we know where to go from there?
Yeah, and what's interesting, and there's a variety of different ways that we can do this, right? So I'm going to step into a few different ways. One way is to look at our mindsets. Our mindsets are intimately connected to our being side because they're about how our bodies are wired to operate, more self-protective or more value creating. So if you're listening to this, I've developed a mindset assessment on my website called the Personal Mindset Assessment. It's free. Anybody could take it, and it will help them to evaluate the quality of their mindset. So that's a helpful tool, but not everybody has access to that. I mean, it's free now. You've heard about it, but not everybody knows about it. But beyond that, another way to kind of gauge this is window of tolerance. The window of tolerance was popularized by a psychologist called, his name is Daniel Siegel. He's written a great book called Mindsight, and he dives into this concept there as well as in other places. But window of tolerance is effectively how easily triggered are we to stress, pressure, complexity, uncertainty, etc. So we have a window that when the stress is low in our lives, it's a window in which our body's nervous system is regulated. And so when challenges come our way, when we're in this regulated state, we can navigate those challenges rather effectively. We are in cognitive and emotional control. But the more stress that we experience, or if you're anything like me, if you get hangry, then you kind of sense that you're moving closer to the edge of your window of tolerance where you're losing cognitive and emotional control. And there's even times where we'll call it triggered, and we actually go outside of our window of tolerance and we've lost almost all cognitive and emotional control. And so when we move closer to the edge of our window of tolerance or even beyond it, we become more reactive as opposed to intentionally responsive. So one of the things that we need to recognize is all of us, the width of our window of tolerance differs, just as we differ in height or weight. So the wider our window of tolerance, our greater capacity to stay in cognitive and emotional control. across difficult situations. And our window of tolerance is also something that we could widen. We can expand. In fact, as we elevate along our being side, that's what happens. So people with a wider window of tolerance are at a higher altitude along their being side. People with a narrower window of tolerance, more reactive individuals, for example, then they're going to be that's a sign that they're lower on their being side. So that's another, I think, a helpful way to kind of gauge our altitude along that being side. The field of developmental psychology is the field that has actually done the most research along our being side. Now, developmental psychology has historically focused on child development. We know that children go through different developmental stages. They go from infancy to adulthood. But a narrow kind of area of focus for developmental psychologists is adult development. And what they've found is that just as children go through different development stages, adults can go through different adult development stages. In fact, what they found is that there's 3 primary adult development stages or levels. And what's interesting about this is that while adults can develop, what they found is that most adults don't develop in adulthood along their being side. So if there's 3 levels along our being side, let's just call them for now, level 1, level 2, level 3, 64% of adults operate in level 1 and never get to level 2. 35% get to level 2 and only 1% gets to level 3. So there's not many that operate there. And so one of the things that I've learned as I've kind of understand this is the reality is that most of us and most of the people that we know operate at this base level, which is a rather self-protective way to operate, right? So for example, if I were to say to you, how do most people respond to constructive criticism? You would say they get defensive, right? And that's a self-protective strategy in that moment. But it's one that probably is something that holds them back from learning, growing, and developing. So that's a self-protective reaction as opposed to a value-creating response. So most of us, and most of the people we associate with, are people that operate at this lower being side level. So this kind of becomes the norm. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's very cognitively and emotionally sophisticated. And so when we understand this framework, that's another way to gauge it. And in fact, I've got another free assessment on my website that will allow you to kind of gauge what level you tend to operate at. It's called a vertical development assessment.
Very literally, once we've assessed that, once we know where we're at, what is the trick to leveling up?
Yeah. At its core, what we've got to recognize is our being side is connected to our internal operating system, which really is our nervous system. So we have got to engage in efforts to better regulate and upgrade our body's nervous system. And I think that there's 3 different levels that we could think about doing work on our nervous system. So I'm going to say that there's surface level approaches, there's deeper level approaches, and there's deepest level approaches. So at the surface level are things that I think are fairly common and they're being increasingly promoted. These are things like meditation, journaling, gratitude journaling, engaging in self-talk, doing like we see cold plunges. These are all actually activities that help us better regulate our body's nervous system. And so I think that they're surface level in that they holistically help us better regulate ourselves. To get into the deeper level, I think that's where mindsets reside. Because again, most people aren't conscious of our mindsets. And so if we could help them to become conscious of our mindsets, we are getting directly at one of the primary jobs of our internal operating system, which is how our body makes meaning of our world. And if we can awaken to how we make meaning of our world or how we're prone to make meaning of our world, then we could do the work of adjusting and improving how we make meaning of our world. So for me, and that's where this is the space that I primarily play in terms of the coaching and the consulting that I do, is I help do some of this deeper level, it's called vertical development work as opposed to horizontal development work. So that's the deeper level strategy. At the deepest level, this is where we find things like therapy, like psychological therapy, trauma healing therapy, And even if people have neurodivergence, then we like ADHD, for example, is something that impacts our being side. There's what's called neurofeedback therapy, and that could help us rewire our brain. And then one of the things that I've kind of got my ear to the ground on is some of the latest research coming out with psychedelic assisted therapy. So all of the initial research that seems to be coming out now is suggesting that it's one of the most effective ways of rewiring our body's nervous system. And so those are, I don't play at that level because I don't have the training for either any of those things. But I've participated, for example, in trauma healing therapy. That's been a part of my own personal development journey. And I would say I'm currently not engaging with my therapist, but I started that process about 4 years ago. And I spent 2 years working with a trauma therapist to heal from some stuff in my past, right? So, and I would say 5 years ago, when I was on the podcast, if you would have asked me if I had trauma in my past, I would have said no. I had great parents. They stayed married. They went to every basketball game I ever played. But what I've come to realize is that while my parents were always there for me physically, they were rarely there for me emotionally. So I've got some emotional neglect in my background, and I didn't know that 5 years ago. And I've come to awaken to that and engage with the trauma therapist to help me kind of heal my body from that experience. I guess one of the things that I've learned is how we are wired to survive our childhood is not the wiring that we need to be successful as adults and as leaders. And that's ultimately what we're talking about, is how do we rewire ourselves? And what I've learned just engaging in this deepest level strategy of engaging with a trauma therapist is doing that healing work has done, I have grown and developed more as a person in that 2 years than I had the prior 16 years of my adult life. And I think at the end of the day, that's why coming on this podcast, sharing these ideas is meaningful to me, because at the end of the day, if we want to elevate along our being side at a foundational level, it's about healing our minds, our bodies, and our hearts. And if we want to become transformationally better, that's what it requires. It requires healing. And I've just come to learn that most of us need some healing.
The first time you joined the program, we discussed your book, which was just about to release, Success Mindsets. We've touched today on a lot of the material that's in Becoming Better, your latest book. But in the meantime, you've also put out another great book, The Elevated Leader. We don't want to overlook that.
For sure. And thank you for bringing it up. And in fact, we have talked about it. So when I talked about those 3 adult development levels, level 1, level 2, level 3, that's what The Elevated Leader is all about. Getting to know those 3 levels and allowing us to use that framework to introspect about at the time I wasn't calling it this, but I was calling it the quality of our internal operating system. But now the terminology we've used here is that plus elevating along our being side.
You mentioned a number of assessments available on your website today that people can go and start taking action on what they've heard about today. Lay that website on us one more time and talk about what some of those assessments are and any other free tools.
For sure. So there's the 2 on my website, ryangottfredson.com. There's a free personal mindset assessment, a free vertical development assessment. Again, both of those are help us to awaken to the quality along our being side. And then if you wanted to do deeper work for yourself, I do engage in coaching to help people to upgrade themselves. Or when I work with organizations, what I'll generally do is I'll have groups or teams or even the entire organization take these assessments, and then I could aggregate those results up to a collective level. And we could look at the collective mindsets of an organization, of a group of leaders, or of a team. So if anybody wants to do some of that deeper work beyond just taking a couple of assessments, would love to have some conversations with folks. What I've experienced, because I've worked with hundreds of organizations, thousands of leaders, is for every group that I've worked with, this is an incredibly eye-opening experience, and which allows for transformation to occur. And I just feel blessed to kind of be playing in a spot and in a place where I could help people to awaken to the deeper sense of themselves so that they can elevate themselves at this foundational level.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for taking some time to join us in the program today and for helping us become better.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for creating this platform. I know having a podcast is not an easy thing to do, and it's actually a very generous thing to do. So appreciate your willingness to do that so that people like me can share our ideas.
If you enjoy this podcast, please make sure to subscribe. And to stay updated on everything that the Action Catalyst is up to, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Action Catalyst Podcast and on Twitter at Catalyst_Action. And thanks for listening.